It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the Green Bylaws Toolkit webinar in support of the upcoming release of the second edition of the Green Bylaws Toolkit. My name is Neil Fletcher. I'm the Wetlands Coordinator of the BC Wildlife Federation and the Wetland Stewardship Partnership of BC. I will be your moderator for today's event. Just as a side note, the Wetland Stewardship Partnership is a collaborative initiative among a number of provincial conservation organizations, industry partners, and federal and provincial government agencies who are working to conserve and protect wetlands in British Columbia. Supporting local and regional government has been a key objective of our partnership, and the Wetland Stewardship Partnership, along with Ducks Unlimited Canada, Grasslands Conservation Council of BC, Environment Canada, and the Province of BC, originally commissioned the Environmental Law Centre and at the University of Victoria to develop the Green Bylaws Toolkit. This particular initiative went beyond just wetland protection, as the Green Bylaws Toolkit benefits all types of important ecosystems and environmental values, from fish and species at risk to drinking water and green spaces. Many of you who are involved in municipal and regional environmental planning around the province will be familiar with the Green Bylaws Toolkit as the go-to reference document since it was first released. You'll find this document on the desks of many local government staff as they prepare bylaws and while they update their official community plans. The Stewardship Centre of BC, who administers the website for downloading the Bylaws Toolkit, exclaims it's among their most frequently visited sites with nearly 1,300 views a month. Since its release in November 2007, where there have been changes to laws and regulations and much feedback from users in this document, this triggered an initiative to update the document in order to maintain its relevancy and provide additional tools to support local government. The second edition is on the brink of being released. It's currently going through a beautification process. Those of you who are joining us today who've provided your emails will be among the first to receive a link to the new version once it's released. Early this spring, we spoke to Deborah Curran, lead author of the toolkit, about the potential to host this webinar in tandem with the release of the second edition of the toolkit. And on her recommendations, she helped identify staff she considered leaders in environmental planning from 3 local governments to share their insights into their experience implementing green bylaws and related policies. With the help of Polis, a project on ecological governance based out of UVic, we're able to accommodate all of you here today through their webinar platform. And special thanks to Megan Spencer, who helped with technical aspects. There are approximately 80 participants who've registered today. And our agenda for the day is we'll start with a presentation from Deborah Curran on the Green Bylaws Toolkits and some of the new content. And then we'll go through 3 case studies from the various local government representatives who Deborah has recommended have some great stories to share with you today. That includes Heather Beresford from the Resort Municipality of Whistler, Adrian Pollard with the District of Saanich, and Todd Cashin with the City of Kelowna. Our partnering organizations are many. A number of them were mentioned just earlier on the first slide. So just wanted to recognize Environment Canada, the Environmental Law Centre with the University of Victoria, Polis, BC Wildlife Federation, the Stewardship Centre for British Columbia, Grasslands Conservation Council of British Columbia, Government of British Columbia, Ducks Unlimited Canada, and of course the Wetland Stewardship Partnership of BC. I'd also like to thank the 3 local governments who are here with us today. District of Saanich, the Resort Municipality of Whistler, and the City of Kelowna. Financial support for this webinar couldn't have been made this event possible, and that includes Wildlife Habitat Canada, Environment Canada, and the Real Estate Foundation of BC. I'd especially like to thank Deborah Curran and Ethan Crindle, who had taken the lead on revising the new edition of the Green Bylaws Toolkit. Also, the many local and regional staff from around BC who have tested the first edition and have provided feedback for the second, and the many reviewers who are involved in the process along the way. You know who you are. So a few things before we begin. There are a few housekeeping items I'd like to run through with you. The first thing has to do with audio. We have a blanket mute on everyone, which means we won't have any audio feedback to distract us from the presentations. So that might raise the question, well, how do we go about dealing with questions? I see many of you are using the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. After the speakers have finished presenting, that's where we'll handle questions. Each presenter will have roughly 45 minutes. If there's time remaining after their presentation, I'll go through any remaining questions to pass on to our presenters. I'll serve as a moderator and read them aloud as they come in, and the speaker will be able to answer them. And the final housekeeping item I'd like to share with you is that I think now is a nice opportunity for you to introduce yourself in the chat box and perhaps give a weather update from your region. It's a nice way to get a sense of community in the room since we're all scattered across the country. It's nice to know who is in the room. So if you could say who you are, what organization you're with, and how many folks are listening with you, that should help us feel a bit more like a community. Great, so I see a few names coming in. As you're typing in, I'm going to pass the mic over to Deborah. Deborah, thank you so much for making yourself available today to provide your insights and experience over the last 8 years of the first Green Bylaws Toolkit till today. It's a pleasure to have you join us.
Hi, Neil. Thanks very much, and thanks for organizing all of this. And particular hello to my favorite people out there in the municipal and local government world. The only reason we have the Green Bylaws Toolkit is because you're willing to share your stories with us on a continual basis, and we then try and tell the stories through the toolkit. As I sat down to read through the second edition from start to finish, I sort of braced for boredom. And I sort of had to steel myself to spend many hours doing that. But I really was amazed to find that I was not bored at all. Maybe the legal part's a little boring, but rereading the stories and the richness of the experience that comes through and the way in which different packages of bylaws are put together uniquely by each local government is really sort of, they stand the test of time, and they also are a great way for us to reacquaint ourselves with the principles of green bylaws and the verbiage that goes on around them. And what I mean by that is we often get caught in kind of the media storm or the way in which landowners characterize how we're stealing our property rights or regulating them to a certain extent, rather than thinking of ecological health and environmental protection as a responsibility that we all take on. So I still think, in my experience talking with municipal staff and local government staff across the province on a weekly basis, I still think the Green Bylaws Toolkit is a great resource. It still reflects best practices, but we can always do more. I think it's important to emphasize that not that much has really changed. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you would hope that there has been over the last decade kind of a wholesale momentum in moving towards green bylaws. I would definitely say there's some new innovation and some new ways that staff and local governments are using the tools, but we certainly don't have a lot of new authority nor a wholesale or comprehensive adoption of green bylaws. We're also seeing some retrenchment, which is always disappointing. So I think some of our presenters might talk to that. Where I live in the district of Saanich, which has had perhaps some of the oldest and most robustly used environmental development permit regulations in the province. We're seeing some landowners taking sort of a run at it from the perspective of the properties don't possess ecological values. And so reading it in a very narrow sense, when only 5% of properties in Saanich are actually affected by environmental development permit areas. So if we read the language of EDPAs broadly, protecting ecosystems, we could in fact slap an EDPA across the entire landscape of an ecosystem and work towards protecting ecosystems themselves. What I want to do is just go over a little bit what is in the Green Bylaws Toolkit, this updated version. This is a slide of our local government authority for environmental protection broadly put together. It's the same chart as is in edition 1, so not a whole lot has changed in that front. But from the perspective of, I think what has been a big changer in many local governments' sort of views of moving forward into green bylaws or ecosystem protection, and in particular was solidified this summer, was the lack of water around the province, or certainly in the southwest of the province, and the way in which that is going to now be something that has an impact on land use decisions. So in certain local governments, that's always been omnipresent, whether it's in Revelstoke or Golden, where there's always sort of the threat of flood, or controlled water, or somewhere like Kelowna that a few years ago experienced flooding in Mission Creek. But I think the lack of water in particular is going to have an impact on the way in which we conceive of not only our storage capacity in sort of a strictly engineered sense, but how it is that we put water back into the ground, and most importantly, where development is located, whether it's appropriate to be located in a particular area. So I'm very briefly going to go over what is new in this second edition, and then go over the principles that we always talk about. What are the basis of green bylaws? What do we mean by green bylaws in terms of the good planning principles that are based on ecology and ecosystem connectivity that move us towards environmental protection over the long term. I'll then talk a little bit about what is new for local governments, not new in the sense of it's never been seen before, but what I see being emphasized more in addition to, for example, development permit areas and appropriate zoning, what I see to be getting a bit more attention. And then I just wanted to talk about a few additional priorities. So what I'm calling beyond bylaws, and I think you folks, most of you as non-lawyers understand this way better than I do, but I just see bylaws and sort of green bylaws as a technical fix for a larger cultural shift that we need and that staff need to attend to on a more regular basis than putting bylaws in place. And of course, as a lawyer, I would never say there's no place for bylaws. That should be the basis of this cultural shift, but it's only by the reminders and repetition that we are then, we come to this actual cultural shift. So what is new? The toolkit's going to look pretty similar to you if you're familiar with edition 1, and that is it's structured the same way. We have a part 1 that basically sets out the why. Why are we, why green bylaws, and what is the purpose of green bylaws? So that's kind of in part 1. But we have shifted a lot of things and added a lot more things into an appendix, which are essentially little mini chapters, about 5 pages or so, that explain green bylaws or local government jurisdiction and. And so what we see in the appendices are things like a conversation about First Nation and land use, municipal land use jurisdiction, or local government land use jurisdiction, local government jurisdiction and the ALR, climate change and local governments, local government and mining jurisdiction, species at risk, and finally other federal and provincial statutes of importance that have an impact on local governments or may limit what they can do. So we've added to the substance of it on a variety of topics, but those are now contained in the appendices. So what you'll see is the same organization. The front part is sort of an explanation why green bylaws and what kind of packages of bylaws might a local government take. So it's not just one green bylaw, but what's the package that leads towards ecological health. Then the second part is an explanation of each bylaw tool or policy tool, so going from regional growth strategies down to enforcement with everything in between, regulatory bylaws, tree bylaws, zoning, all that, sort of an explanation of their legal basis, and then a whole bunch of case studies in there. There are some new case studies, and we've hopefully accurately updated all of the existing case studies. And then finally, the Green Bylaws Toolkit second edition references a whole bunch of new, what we're calling companion documents that different organizations have developed on specific slices of the Green Bylaws pie. So for example, the Okanagan Basin Water Board has developed the Groundwater Bylaws Toolkit, the Topsoil Bylaws Toolkit, and I think Stormwater Bylaws Toolkit is just coming out. Developed with Care has been updated. And there are a bunch of those kinds of things that we refer to that provide more detail and more depth. All right, so moving on to my second topic, the principles of green bylaws, or the principles of good planning, essentially stay the same. And I think before I've captured them in 8 or 9 bullet points, and today I'm just going to capture them in 5 bullet points. So the first is to designate biodiversity corridors. It's this notion of connectivity. The second is contain the urban footprint, so making sure that we have growth boundaries around built areas. The natural side policies need to work with the urbanization policies. We want to enhance water flows, again getting at this water land use connection. Cluster development, and protect important areas forever. So I will just talk briefly about each of those principles and introduce some new examples from the second edition. So designate biodiversity corridors. What we're seeing increasingly are that local governments are basing regional growth strategies or official community plans or acquisition priorities for parks on biodiversity mapping or ecosystem mapping. And this is an example. It's the Regional Green Blue Spaces system that's long been in place in the capital region. A more recent one is the City of Surrey's Biodiversity Conservation Strategy that they enacted in 2014. It establishes biodiversity goals and targets and conservation priorities, as well as designates 14 biodiversity management areas based on the unique conditions that influence biodiversity. The strategy itself is based on an ecosystem management study that the city completed in 2011, and that study identified what the city is calling a green infrastructure network. So that interconnected network of open spaces, including parks, streams, and other natural areas. And they have 3 different characterizations within the green infrastructure network. So they've got hubs. You have to excuse me, I might cough a bit, I'm just getting over a cold. So those are large intact habitat areas greater than 10 hectares. Sites, which are smaller habitat patches supporting species that are more tolerant to human disturbance, and connecting corridors, which are linear habitat areas 10 to 100 meters in width that encourage the movement of species between fragmented hubs and sites. So staff developed the Green Infrastructure Network, which then forms the backbone of the Biodiversity Conservation Strategy, really responding to 3 core principles: preserving large core habitat areas, ensuring connectivity between habitat areas, and providing a diversity of habitat features. The second principle, or good planning principle, that we base green bylaws on is to contain the urban footprint. So either have urban containment boundaries or growth boundaries in some way, and the vast majority of the regional growth strategies in the province do this based on servicing, so won't allow servicing outside of a defined growth boundary unless certain conditions are applied. Now, those of you in the local government realm know much better than I the influence of a couple of court decisions over the last few years about the impact or the actual sort of the legal tenacity of OCPs and regional growth strategies, and they are largely at this point in time sort of more influential. But at the same time, they are still a statement of who we are as a community, and they do have some sway in terms of what council will look to in the way in which they will make decisions. And you know, the reigning best example is still the District of Saanich's urban growth boundary that was established in 1968. So it's the longest standing one in the province. And you can see the map depiction on the left-hand side, lower left of your screen. The brown is the urbanized part, and the green is the outside of the urban growth boundary. And can you folks see me moving around my little cursor? Does that come up for you? Hearing no, oh, no cursor. Okay, so I'll explain it then. If you basically look to the straight line in the middle of between the brown and the green, so most of them are kind of squiggly lines, but right about equidistant between the two ends of the line between the brown and the green, there's kind of a straight patch. You're actually looking at that in the top right, and you can see the line, which is Wilkinson Road, goes between the rural part and the more suburbanized part. And so there is just, even in application, you can see very directly the impact of that urban growth boundary that's based on no servicing or extension of water service or sewer service, except where there are public health issues involved. The next principle is to enhance water flows, and I think that this, by stating this as a very broad principle, I think a number of things flow from it. So we've been talking about integrated stormwater management, infiltration-based stormwater, you know, no net increase in post-development flows, protecting riparian areas, protecting fish life processes. We've been using that kind of language for over a decade. What we mean by enhancing water flows also gets at the drought aspect of this, and just essentially wanting to enhance the way in which we pay attention to water and the baseline ecological flows that are needed in any ecosystem for maintaining healthy riparian processes. So we have the new Water Sustainability Act coming online or on stream next spring. And the first thing that's going to happen is the province is going to regulate non-domestic groundwater uses. And then shortly after that, they've committed to, well, they have in place a province-wide policy on environmental flows. So any new application they're going to be looking at through the lens of ensuring that there are adequate environmental flows in any stream before they give out additional licenses on that stream. So there are really a myriad of new local government initiatives really stemming from water management, but that go beyond kind of the subdivision servicing bylaw and this integrated watershed management approach. So we're seeing water management plans, well protection plans, regional growth strategies are talking about water. Certainly official community plans and development permit areas have always dealt with riparian, but are now specifically talking about water quantity and putting water back into the ground. Zoning, density bonus, subdivision, and development approval information areas. We also see things like, for example, the Cowichan Valley Regional District and their ongoing attempts at addressing the problems in the Cowichan River. They had a groundwater management study done over the last year, and also a sort of a larger community process on addressing groundwater withdrawals and the effect on the Cowichan River as well. The next principle is to cluster development, and this is a bit of a double-edged sword because you know, it is used often as an excuse to put a development in an area that's inappropriate for that kind of density. but to justify it because the footprint is limited and then the rest of the land will be left as agricultural or whatever. So it still puts a suburban type development in a rural area, calls it a farmstead or a farm village, and then is justified in that way because it protects a portion of the landscape. And you know, that line between decent clustering and sort of an excuse for suburbanization in an inappropriate neighborhood is a conversation that happens differently at every local government elected's table. I can provide you with a couple of what I think are good examples. These are more in the rural, suburban and rural context. I actually think clustering is more appropriate in a greenfield, like within an urban growth boundary greenfield context. I guess that's actually the lower right-hand example is that. It's an entirely suburbanized neighborhood, and then this is much higher density than would have been achieved with single detached homes. But I will give you the Denman Island example because it's really a fascinating example of the community staying true to their official community plan statements while allowing a slight increase and clustering of development on a significant landscape. So the example that I have, which is in the existing toolkit for clustering development, is in the city of Colwood. So they have a site that is on the Esquimalt Lagoon, and it is a migratory bird sanctuary, and it's a large site that you know, had the zoning for what we would consider to be sort of single detached suburban type development from the 70s. When the rezoning went through and all the development permits, the development permit conditions are quite interesting from an ecological perspective, and you can read about them. They clustered the development on the back 70% of the site, renaturalized the creek. The idea was to make it salmon bearing again, and you can see that the entire front part that is adjacent to the migratory bird sanctuary is maintained or reestablished in its natural state. Now, unfortunately, this development sort of hit the 2009 subprime mortgage collapse, and so it hasn't turned out the way that it was designed to, but I think it's a very good example in concept because there are kilometers of public trails on that, and you can also see the ecological and connectivity corridors going up to Royal Roads University and other areas throughout that entire municipality. The diagram on the left just shows the Denman Island, and the cluster example that I'm giving here, it's a rezoning and also a clustering of development, involved the North Denman lands. And the community had been dealing with the ecological impacts of logging on a significant part of the island between 1997 and 2009. And the 7 parcels that made up the North Denman lands bordered the Comas Bluffs on the Strait of Georgia, in the northeast in Chickadee Lake wetlands and other lands zoned for resource, rural, residential, and agricultural on the other sides. So following logging, in particular on a Gulf island, you get the usual scenario where the landowner then applies, either sells, and then the new landowner applies to subdivide it for residential properties and an increase in density on the site. After the Islands Trust turned down the initial proposal, which included a significant donation of parkland to the community, the Islands Trust negotiated a density-neutral solution with the developer. So the result is an innovative amenity density bonus on the North Denman lands that included a downzoning on crown parcels that will never be developed on anyway. And that's how you got your density-neutral, ultimately, development. So the Islands Trust agreed to grant an amenity density bonus of 31 residential units to the developer, which resulted in a total of 54 units. At the same time, the developer donated 505 acres to the province of BC for inclusion in a provincial park. And the final element of the deal was the Islands Trust downzoned 7 parcels of Crown land, which effectively deleted those 31 additional residential units from the Denman Island zoning bylaw. and then making the deal density neutral and in accordance with the official community plan. The entire package also saw the protection of 2 ecologically significant areas by conservation covenant. The Denman Conservancy Association holds a conservation covenant on 41 hectares of Comas Bluff, the purpose of which is to protect, preserve, conserve, maintain, enhance, or restore the covenant area. And they also hold a conservation covenant on 31.5 hectares of the railway grade marsh. The final principle, I guess, long-standing principle for green bylaws or for good planning is to protect important areas forever. So this is the acquisition of ecologically sensitive and important ecological features as public land. Now, we all know there is no way we're ever going to be able to acquire the level of connectivity or ecological features in public landholding as we would like to. And so it really is a partnership between local governments and landowners and the rest of the citizens of a regional district or a municipality to maintain ecological health. Something that we are seeing increase is the establishment of conservation funds. So direct funding from property taxes to parkland acquisition and other environmental programs. And this provides a consistent, planned amount of money that can be allocated to parkland acquisition over time or to ecological restoration or other types of environmental projects. So in addition to the Capital Regional District's Park Acquisition Fund, we've also seen the East Kootenay Regional District in the Robson Valley and the Cowichan Valley Regional District create funds as well in the last several years. And what is pictured here is the South Okanagan-Similkameen Conservation Partnership Guide to establishing regional conservation funds in BC. So it kind of goes through, if you're a municipality or if you're a regional district, how you do that, and then case studies on the different conservation funds that are in place in BC. So those are the principles. So what I'd like to do is, for my last 10 minutes or so, just talk about what are some of the new things that I'm seeing in terms of focus of local governments, and then just talk about a few additional priorities and what I'm calling not just bylaws that, as I said, you're more familiar with than I am. But I see it as increasingly important. So in terms of what's new, and again, these are nothing new to you, but I just see them coming up more frequently. So there seems to be a lot more focus on corridors and connectivity rather than just on ecological protection and preservation of parkland or green space. So as I mentioned, the case study from the City of Surrey, the Resort Municipality of Whistler went through a whole protected areas network initiative that Heather Beresford will talk about in a few minutes. In the Metro Vancouver has developed its ecological health network. So there's a lot of discussion of connectivity, biodiversity, and health all kind of rolled into one, and this sense that we need to have a much better grasp of connectivity across our landscapes, and often, in particular on the southwest coast, rooted in our riparian areas. The second thing that I see more of, again, are conservation funds. So we have a couple more, and other places that have them already are also, that are quite small, are also looking to increase them. So I have to just put out there that for the capital region, it was entirely uncontroversial to increase. So we first agreed to a 10-year conservation fund of $10 per property per year. So that was the amount on our property taxes, and it was entirely uncontroversial at the end of 10 years to increase that amount to $20 per property per year for another 10 years. So it's interesting, once the conversation is had, then people are quite accepting of it. I'm going to throw my next point out, the RAR effect, or the Riparian Areas Regulation effect. I'm going to throw this out, and I'm just waiting for your blowback on this. I can sense there's going to be a whole lot of hot air coming my way, but I would argue that the riparian areas regulation, although still controversial and definitely lots of reasons to pick at it, is an accepted part of the way that we do business now, such that it's not, riparian protection is no longer seen as kind of an oddity or as something that is maybe an add-on to ecological protection. It's part of our core green infrastructure, and we've been doing it for long enough that it's just part of the way that we do business. So feel free to jump in if you have, or because you have comments on that, feel free to jump in on that particular point. And finally, and I've mentioned this before, water I think is going to be the biggest part of the land use conversation into the future, and perhaps will be more effective than our urban growth boundaries from a zoning perspective. You know, we have changing hydrology, whether or not we link it to climate change or not. Municipalities and regional districts are the first institutions to notice that hydrology is changing and our watersheds are changing. So we're having more extreme weather, storm events, and dry periods. And so water is now going to be driving some green infrastructure approaches, like having multifunctional green infrastructure where you have a playing field that is deliberately flooded as part of your flood management and that kind of thing. Also, we'll see more retrofitting of urban areas to infiltrate rainwater. So downtown Victoria, we just are starting to see in sidewalk rainwater gardens or rain gardens, and it adds beautifully to the sort of dense downtown concrete core. And it's also could, if enough of it is done, significantly decrease the load on existing infrastructure. Todd Cashin from Kelowna will also talk about the Habitat Conservation Bank and their initiative in that way, and that is also part of trying to retrofit existing channelized riparian areas. Finally, I just wanted to talk about a few additional priorities, so sort of beyond bylaws. And I guess I go, in mentioning these, I think I'm thinking about culture shift. So it's easy for me to be an environmentalist here in the capital region. It's very green, we can bike everywhere. People generally want to save trees, but sort of when push comes to shove and I'm not allowed to cut a tree down on my property, then I sort of revert to private property type arguments rather than maintaining this sense that ecological health is everyone's responsibility. And so I can point to certain local governments I think have been very attentive to this approach over the years. For example, the District of North Vancouver and their commitment to tree preservation. You know, when people say, well, a tree's going to fall on my house, they counter with, well, there's lots of different ways we can maintain the health of our trees and ensure that that doesn't happen, or understand when a tree is becoming weak and then we can remove it at that time rather than just clearing around all houses. So they've been very attentive to that cultural notion of we are a treed area, we are a treed community, and we value that, and here are the bylaws and policies in place to support that. I think that we do somewhat of an okay job of linking growth management with ecological protection, but more from a climate change perspective or a preservation of agricultural land perspective. So I think there's a whole lot more that we can do as people are interested in ecological health in supporting urban side policies as a direct complement to protecting more rural side ecological values. So we have to foster compact, complete communities, minimum densities, while also protecting the environment. And I also already gave you the example of bad cluster development. I would just return to the fundamental point of any land use decision is that location is a pass-fail criteria. You do not put up a LEED Platinum building in the middle of a cornfield, right? Like it's just, that's the stark example, no matter how good it is. Location has to be pass-fail, and there has to be some sort of orderly development to the way in which we extend servicing and achieve density. I talked about this a little bit already. Ecological health is everyone's responsibility, so increasingly we understand that there is no way that regional districts and municipalities can achieve ecological health or environmental protection by themselves. There is no way they're going to have enough funding to purchase all the ecologically sensitive areas from private landowners and turn those into public spaces. So just as landowners in the interest of the public are expected to be subjected to extensive land use regulation in Canada, that's the law. So too can we be subject to land use regulation in furtherance of environmental protection. And so then it's up to local governments to message that in a certain way that, that assists us all to realize that for certain values or for the restoration of certain values, it's everybody's responsibility, including those private landowners. I find it interesting that no one would stand, like a single detached landowner, it's no longer the conversation that a single detached landowner would stand up and say, I'm not allowed to build a high-rise on my land, and talk about that as unfair. I mean, maybe in some of your communities they do, but I think there's a well enough understanding of the way in which municipalities work that, you know, there is some sense of the way in which communities develop, maintain property values, and also keep the character the same. But yet I find it very interesting that we can still stand up and say it's unfair that I'm prevented from putting green lawn across my entire backyard just because there are ecosystem values. To me, it's qualitatively exactly the same thing. Environmental regulation is just the same as, you know, restrictions on the use of my property, which are entirely valid. And then when we do put something good in place, when we put the green bylaws in place, we need to continue with that messaging and that social marketing, in not only just to achieve acceptance of it, but to continue on or build that culture of I am a responsible citizen who delights in being part of the ecological health of my municipality. And there's a bunch of different ways that local governments do that. You know, you don't necessarily have to have a continual We Love Nature campaign going on, but at least have a positive sort of renaturalization initiatives, or what I loved, I think it's either the Cowichan Valley Regional District or the City of Duncan have a new, this is the new normal, folks. They've got a new normal program or initiative that's talking about, you know, floods and drought. That's our new normal, and what are we going to do about it? And finally, as those of you, many of you know me, I can never leave a conversation about land use without reminding everyone about Section 914 of the Local Government Act, which is our friend, and it's also in particular the friend of your elected officials. And you might want to try and remind them at least once a year about Section 914 if you don't do it on a regular basis, that if a municipality or a regional district enacts a bylaw or issues a permit that has an impact on the value of someone's land, they do not owe that landowner any compensation unless the regulation restricts their property to only a public use. So if you zone someone's land as parkland, you'd have to compensate them. But if you zone it to, as 240 hectare minimum and the only private use is one single detached dwelling, you do not need to compensate them for that particular decision in the public interest. So from time to time, I'm always amazed at sort of the American approach that landowners take, our landowners, Canadian landowners take to municipal regulation, and there's really this notion of property rights that we simply don't have in Canada. And Section 914 reflects that very handily, in that we really can withstand a very high degree of environmental regulation without needing to compensate landowners. So with that, you will get an email about when the second edition is out. It's momentary. It was just the links weren't working. And so the person who's doing the layout is fixing that. So it really is the content is all finished. But it's not quite there yet, uploaded, but you will get notice when it is. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Deborah. I think we'll take questions till 1:55 for your presentation, since you started a little later. I do see two that might start a bit of conversation here. The first was from Terry Martin, who has asked, do you think water issues will lead to real discussion on local governments establishing limits to growth?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are only a few local governments in British Columbia who truly have sort of addressed this notion of limits to growth in a soft way, I would say. So Denman Island has a zero density increase or zero population increase OCP. So they have said, as an island community, we can't sustain further residences in our ecosystem. And they've also backed that up with a variety of other policies. For example, they have no overnight accommodation, standalone overnight accommodation, meaning you can't rent a cabin, for example, to stay on Denman. The other example that plays out in a different way is the resort municipality of Whistler's bed limit. So they had approved a bunch of rezoned a bunch of new density, and they wanted to wait and see what that bed limit, the impact of that on their community before they went ahead and allowed any additional development to occur, or at least zoning. So they have an exception for employee housing. And then the third one that has done it on ecological limits, but I am not familiar with where they're at right now, is, oh no, and it's just slipped my mind. It's in Alberta, and it's just south of Calgary, Okotoks. And they actually based their population on what they thought that their water and therefore their ecosystem could withstand in terms of the population of that area. So it'll be interesting because we'll get a somewhat of a conflict between the legislation. The Local Government Act says that we need to put in our OCPs how we're going to accommodate the growth that's coming to us. And yet at the same time, some communities, it's entirely within their authority to say, we are going to simply stop at this point in terms of providing water service. And anything beyond that will need to be accommodated in other ways. And so there's a couple of ways to do that. You can either create significant more efficiencies within your existing water system, so require people to conserve, have block pricing, fix your leaks, don't allow people to water their lawns, that kind of thing. Or you can allow people to go elsewhere for their water. And now that we're going to have groundwater licensing through the province, as well as environmental flow regulations for the province, it'll be a bit of a squeeze between what local governments can do and also then what the province can do. So that's a bit of a waffly answer. I don't know whether it's going to assist local governments to set true growth limits, but if they're looking forward in terms of liability and ability to service or provide services to their populations, I think water will be a limiting factor.
Great, thank you. Two other comments came in. They're more comments than questions, but I will read them as they stand here. Ian Hall suggests that there are still people in the SLRD and in the ALR that do not understand the need for ALR regulations on non-farm uses as well as RAR2. The attitude of this is my property and I can do whatever I want on it still exists, unfortunately. And I'll just let that simmer for a moment. I'll read Pamela's comments as well, which is on the riparian areas regulation. RAR may be part of the regulatory landscape, but so was riparian protection prior to RAR. Most of us remember the SPR and the previous land development guidelines that were used in high population areas of the province. The issue isn't that it's a norm. It's a norm. It is, as exemplified in the Ombudsman's report in 2013, that it is inconsistently applied. As well, it does not adequately protect full ecosystem services or species at risk requirements for many species. add to that the restrictions in application to certain types of zoning. Okay, and then they've added, both of them have added a bit. He's just making a comment in response to the potential widespread acceptance of RAR and other land use regulations. And Pamela says, my question is, how can we ensure better clarity around the limitations in RAR? It is not a panacea for riparian ecosystem protection. So maybe I think maybe answering Pamela's question might answer both of their questions.
Sure. So what, in terms of the ALR, there is a perception that the RAR does not apply on the ALR. And I will allow Todd, or I'll encourage Todd to speak to that, not necessarily give you the legal view, but give the example of what Kelowna is doing in terms of regulating farm uses in riparian areas, because in my opinion, it's the first, well, it's not in my opinion, it's the first municipality that I know of that is taking a kick at actually trying to improve riparian health in on lands in the ALR. Typically, as you all know, local governments simply exempt the application or refuse to enforce it because of sort of the unique status of farmers and farmland and the way that it attracts some additional protections from the province. In terms of the problems with the RAR, absolutely, it is a flawed methodology and its application isn't nearly as broad as we would like it. Therefore, there is a huge opportunity for municipalities and regional districts to designate development permit areas for the protection of the natural environment in riparian areas that go beyond fish protection and include all habitat protection, include species at risk, and go much more broad. And so what that does is, although there is a specific methodology mandated for the RAR, that doesn't preclude a municipality or regional district for requiring additional information and considerations in the riparian area.
Thank you. So I think what we might do is, if other people have questions for you, Deborah, we'll leave those till the end of the workshop and invite people to ask additional questions and engage in more dialogue. So thank you so much for kicking things off. It looks like Todd is answering a few questions here, and Todd, we will give you the microphone near the end of this seminar so you can elaborate upon your points that you're making right now. I just wanted to do a test with Adrian. Adrian, can you press *6 on your phone, and we'll see if we can connect with you?
Okay, I did it. Can you hear me?
Yay, excellent. Okay, great. So maybe if Megan, if you can help us, I believe, just double check my notes here, but I believe, so Adrian, you will be talking after Heather. So Heather, you're going to be coming up for the next presentation. And again, if you have questions for Deborah, please hold on to those and ask near the end of this webinar, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. Thank you. So Heather, if you can press *6, and we'll just make sure we can connect with you.
Okay, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yep. And there's your presentation, so you can just advance the slides, I believe, from the comfort of your desktop.
I wish I was in a lounge chair then. Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm Heather Beresford. I'm the Environmental Stewardship Manager at the Resort Municipality of Whistler, and I'm going to be talking about our development permit areas for the protection of the natural environment. I want to talk a little bit about the early days of it, because it has been a bit of a long process for us. How we identified the ecosystems and which ones we did identify, our policy approach, and then looking at the DPAs in particular, and then our process for dealing with them, with the landowners, and internally here at the municipality, referring among staff, and with the qualified environmental professionals, the QEPs, and then our enforcement ability. Whistler has long recognized the need to protect our natural environment, not just for our community and quality of life here, but also because our economy depends almost entirely on tourism and recreation. So obviously, people are coming here for a beautiful, healthy environment to be able to get outside and ski, ride bikes, do a myriad of other activities. So it's in our best interest to protect that. It's really, the golden egg that our goose is laying. So back in 2002, the municipality developed our environmental strategy. And at that time, it was identified as one of the priorities to create some sort of what became called the Protected Area Network, to be this ecologically viable network of critical areas composed of the unique and sensitive habitats and the corridors connecting them. So we took that environmental strategy here in Municipal Hall and said, how do we make that happen? And we called together a group of folks from across different aspects of the community, from the real estate development sector to recreation, environmentalists, and we sat down and said, how are we going to be able to identify these? And it quickly came out that we needed to have some base mapping. We didn't have it at the time, so we had to take a step back, and we completed terrestrial ecosystem mapping of the entire municipality in 2003. And we're able to identify all the different kinds of ecosystems we had here. So now we were basing our decision-making on data rather than just opinion. We didn't want to know where people like to walk their dogs and their favorite trails. We wanted to be able to make this a scientific rationale for choosing these areas. So we recalled our stakeholder group, and we spent quite a bit of time, over a year, a couple of years actually, working on this. We also brought in a professor from Simon Fraser University who was an expert in GIS and connectivity. And at that time, the municipality recognized the need to do this, but there was also some pushback on, how are we going to do it? We didn't want to make it too onerous for developers, didn't want to make it too onerous for staff. Just trying to find a balance there to be able to protect those areas, but also make it workable. So in the end, we ended up with a really long definition of what our Protected Areas Network would be about. We were trying to describe what we wanted to protect as well as how we were going to do it. And we wanted to be able to have this full package. It's one thing to identify where they are, but we had to also think about what are the regulatory measurements and management of this program, how are we going to do it, and again, in a fair and cost-effective manner so that the public understood, staff understood how it was going to be implemented and run and managed over the long term, because we got ourselves pretty complicated there for a while. These are the ecosystems we did end up identifying in the end, and we placed the highest priority on wetlands and riparian areas. By this time, the riparian area regulation had come on stream, so to speak, so we did have to include that, and we identified our riparian areas. We went back to the BC Conservation Data Center and looked at their terminology and classification systems that they use for their sensitive and important ecosystems so that we didn't have to reinvent the wheel. We looked at identifying these areas based on ecological attributes of rarity, fragility, biodiversity, specialized habitat, specialized functions, and connectivity. And we ended up mapping them at 1 to 15,000 using the terrestrial ecosystem mapping. And that was probably a limitation of budget more than anything, because at 1 to 15,000, you can't really identify the exact boundaries of those ecosystems, because we couldn't get enough time out on the ground to do the ground truthing. So at 1 to 15,000, it's really just a red flagging tool to be able to say, we think it's likely that ecosystem exists there. So that was a limitation of our mapping. We still have that limitation, but in our process, we require the proponent, the landowner, to hire a qualified environmental professional, a QEP, to go out on the ground and ground truth it and identify exactly where those ecosystems may be on their site. In the beginning, we identified 3 levels of protection for these ecosystems. from most to least restrictive. Wetlands were the most restrictive, and we were calling those PAN level 1, and had a series of conditions and restrictions around how development could happen there, and down to avalanche tracks, connectivity corridors with fewer restrictions, more of a way to assess what was happening on the ground and determine what types of conditions we might place on those areas if development was to take place there. So again, our priorities were on water, wetlands, riparian areas, and especially around old growth forests as well, because that's very important to our community. As we moved along, we entered into a stage of where we were working on our Whistler 2020 sustainability plan. That was a large community process where we had 16 strategy areas, one of them being protecting the natural environment. We had community roundtables meeting to discuss what the priorities were, and again, the Protected Areas Network idea was viewed as being a top priority, and so it became embedded in the Whistler 2020 document. You can still find it on our website. It's built into our budget process. It's built into our OCP and our corporate plans. So the community as a whole and the municipality as the local government recognized, again, that protecting the natural environment was a priority. So when we were updating our official community plan in 2013, we were embedding the Protected Area Network strategy within that as well. So taking it from where we thought that it might be a standalone strategy to incorporating it right into our official community plan. So what was gained by doing that? It's now embedded in the highest level policy document that guides council and staff on decision making with respect to land use within the municipality. This was really important to us. It helps us as staff be able to communicate with the public that this is a community priority, and it's can't be sort of left off to the side. It's built right into all of our referral processes and development permits application processes. But what was lost when we did that? We had a really hard time being able to include the connectivity corridors. We retained the riparian area connectivity corridors because we could distinctly and discreetly identify riparian corridors according to the RAR definition, 30 meters from top of bank. With the other connectivity corridors we were interested in for wildlife, particularly bears, because bears are a big deal in our community. We were advised by our legal counsel that we couldn't include those because they could not be identified with boundaries on a development permit area map. Those are something that we had envisioned being identified through a review process as a development application came in. But we just couldn't include them in the DP areas because they needed to be able to have hard boundaries, and we weren't able to do that. And also the idea of being able to proactively identify a network. When they're put into development permit areas, we then just deal with each site as it comes in a development application. So we weren't able to do what we had initially envisioned of being able to say, this is the network across the entire municipality, and see that there's no map you can pull up right now that says this is our protected area network. So that's something that staff, we're working on right now. We want to be able to identify the greenest of the green, if you will, of what's out there and take that next step. So right now, the areas that we have included in our development permit areas, wetland, riparian, forested floodplain, old growth and mature forest, early succession forest, and then high mountain and avalanche tracks. So we had a longer list in the beginning with a lot more gradations, but this is where we ended up in the end. And the Protected Area Network strategy, all those individual ecosystems, they morphed into these areas shown on our development permit area maps. And I'll just run through the 3 development permit areas that we have now, where we consolidated those ecosystems that were identified. So we've left wetlands out as their own development permit area because we recognize that we don't want to have any development happening around wetlands. So these are really still those no-go top priority areas to avoid development and to mitigate any effects of development that may be on their fringes. Our second development permit area is around riparian, so you'll see that we can identify all the riparian corridors. This gives us some connectivity throughout the valley, but as I said, we weren't able to include a connectivity corridors for other reasons. We ask proponents to get a qualified environmental professional to do an assessment based on the RAR assessments, but we also want them to look at other upland effects of their development for water flow, overland water flow, how their development may affect other wildlife besides fish. So we have based it on the RAR process and assessment and goals, but also added in our other specific goals here in Whistler to look at broader effects on especially water flow and other wildlife. And then finally, we have our third development permit area that we've just called other sensitive ecosystems. So this catches forested floodplains, this catches avalanche tracts. So in effect, when you put these three together, you'll see that the white area in the middle of the map, that's our already developed neighborhoods and matches pretty closely with our Whistler Urban Development Containment Area. So if you're trying to do development on anywhere in the municipality now, besides places that have already been developed, you are going to be in a development permit area for the protection of the natural environment one way or the other. So we have captured all the remaining areas in the municipality. So looking at process and enforcement. So if somebody comes in and they want to do a development within a DP area, we have a land use fees and procedures bylaw that lays out the steps for how you need to get approvals. So our first thing that we ask people to do is to do a site investigation report with a qualified environmental professional. This is going back to what I was talking about with the limitations of our mapping. We need someone to go on site with the proper credentials. We use the same definition of QEP that the RAR uses, and have that person confirm or deny that the ecosystem in question is actually on their site. If it is, or if it is not, that's the end of the story. The QEP writes a letter and says, no, that ecosystem actually doesn't exist on their property, and so they don't need to do anything further. If it is, if that ecosystem is located on their property, then they're moving on to providing a site assessment report. So this has to address all the anticipated impacts of the proposed development and make recommendations for how it can be accommodated within the OCP development permit guidelines. If it can't be accommodated without permanent impact to wetlands or riparian, the proponent must identify areas for replacement of that habitat or enhancement of the habitat, and we ask for that compensation or replacement to be at a 2-to-1 ratio. So we're trying to encourage people to find ways to avoid the most sensitive areas on their site. And if they really, really can't, and we work with them quite closely to find alternatives and suggest alternatives, then we're asking for compensation or replacement at 2-to-1. So the development must follow the development permit conditions, or we've enacted an environmental protection bylaw that gives us the ability to give out tickets for it, because without this bylaw in place, if a proponent does not follow the development permit conditions, the only recourse that the municipality has is to go to court. And I don't know about your municipalities, but ours is quite reluctant to do that given the time and the cost and effort. So now we have the ability to, the QEP is monitoring the DP conditions as the project progresses. If the proponent is not following those conditions or is in violation of them, that QEP can report back to the municipality. We will send our environmental stewardship staff and a bylaw officer over there, And if we can't get compliance, we now have the hammer to give a ticket. We have had some people say, well, your tickets aren't that high. You know, there's some, we only have, you know, $500 tickets, that kind of thing, but we can give them out for every day that the violation is in place. So even though some have argued that it may just be viewed as being the cost of doing business, we think that it still has the potential to encourage people to come into compliance when we can deliver that ticket day after day until they're following their conditions. So coming into my last slide, really just the environmental development permit areas allow us to express our environmental goals on the ground and to be able to enforce it quickly and easily if that comes down to be the case. We still try to take the approach that we're going to work with our proponents and our community to create understanding, first of all, of why we want to be doing this, what our community values are, and as a last resort, we would be giving out a ticket, but it is nice to have that option. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Heather. We can take some questions. One that has come up. Have you ever had to challenge a QEP's report or a site investigation?
So has the municipality challenged it? No, we haven't had to challenge a QEP report at this point, and it's one benefit perhaps of being in a fairly small community where we know the areas that are being developed pretty closely, and we just have a couple of companies that generally work up here, so it's a pretty tight connection, and we have good confidence in what's going on and a quick ability to be able to go out and double check. So far, when we've been reviewing the QEP reports, when they come back from the province, we haven't really had any issues with the approach they're taking.
Okay, and two other questions came in. The first one, if you want to, how do we say this, call in Deborah for support on this as well, potentially. Does the DP process apply to authorizations and or permitting provided by the province, by the provincial government on Crown lands?
Well, the DP areas cover all of the lands within the municipality, and a lot of them are Crown lands. So would this be like a commercial recreation application or something from the mountains? We have limited abilities there. Yeah, maybe Deborah could help me out here.
So typically, no. There, as you know, local government jurisdiction from a land use perspective does not extend to the Crown landscape. However, there are exceptions. So the Squamish and Pumice case was a scenario where there was secondary mining activities going on a Crown landscape, but the industrial activity was not integral to the mining permit, and it was a lessee of the province, and therefore it was subject to the zoning bylaw. But I've never seen a case where it's been an actual DP that's been at issue. So I'd have to go back and read that case and see if it was specifically just around use and restrictions or whether it was environmental regulation at all. If local government jurisdiction applies in terms of zoning to lessees of Crown land, then I suspect so do the environmental development permit requirements.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'm getting a clarification, I believe, from Allison Pete, who has said not the authorization, but require a QP assessment. Okay, well, Allison, I guess if that's a question, if you can frame it as that, so then I can get further clarification. But I'll read your other question here, and this is probably, Heather, directed towards you. Another question, does Whistler rely solely on its procedures bylaw for requirements for QEPs, or is there a separate terms of reference as well?
We rely on our fees and procedures bylaw, and in there we give a definition of what a QEP is, and we're following the riparian area regulation assessment for what a QEP needs to be able to prove in order to be qualified to do the job.
Okay, and then, thank you. Tanya has a question which maybe Deborah or Heather, you're welcome to weigh in on this. What about the applicability of a development permit to mining activity on private land?
I haven't had that experience, so I'll leave that to Deborah to comment.
So again, the mining activity itself comes under provincial jurisdiction. So the province regulates mining, but the question then becomes what is necessary for the mining activity and the mining permit, and it's not everything that they want to do. So there might be an argument to be made that in certain operations they would need to process the ore on site in order to move it off site, but in other operations they would not need to do that, and therefore zoning can restrict what occurs on the site.
Great, thank
and
you.
then to extend that, the development permit on mining, again, it would not apply to the mining activity itself, so the extraction of the ore and any necessary activities to get the ore off the site, but it would apply to other activities that are occurring on the site.
Thank you.
And this is great that these questions are being asked because they're all answered in the second edition in terms of there's an appendix that deals explicitly with local government and jurisdiction around mining.
That's a great plug. Thank you, Deborah. And Allison has formulated a question here. So what section of the Local Government Act authorizes the Environmental Protection Bylaw for ticketing purposes? I don't know if that's on the tip of your tongue or not.
Sorry, no, it's not, but I can look that up.
Okay.
I think it's important to be really clear about jurisdiction in this area. So what Whistler is doing is they are essentially providing two different means of regulation for the conditions that are implemented through to the development permit, but they are relying on their regulatory authority, not their development permit authority for enforcement. So they issue a development permit, and as we know, the only way you can enforce those is going to court for a compliance order. But at the same time, given the way that they have worded their development permit, the same activity would be caught under their regulatory environmental bylaw. And that is why they are then able to ticket under the environmental bylaw.
Great, thank you. So one more question is coming in from Jerry Leering. What follow-up has occurred in penalties tickets that the remediation has been effective over what time period?
Well, we adopted the Environmental Protection Bylaw in the springtime of back in 2014, and we have not had to issue a ticket for not complying with DP conditions. So we've been able to get compliance up front. So like I said, it's a bylaw to be able to ticket somebody has to be your last resort. So we work really hard up front with the proponents to make sure that conditions are clear and that we're monitoring to make sure they're following them.
Great, thank you. And it seems like the city of Campbell River will be issuing a ticket this week, so maybe stay tuned for more information from that.
Yeah.
Okay, now I have a comment or potentially a question from Ian, and I'll just read this one as well. I would think that a commercial recreation tenure operator would be subject to a DP area. Zoning does apply to such commercial rec operators or temporary use permits. I don't know if either of you want to comment on that.
I don't have anything to add at this point. I wish I had one of my planners on the line. They probably would.
Okay, well, we'll just we'll leave it at that. Ian, if you want any clarity or to ask ask it in a way of a question, feel free to do so. Thank you very much, Heather, for sharing your insights today, and thank you everybody for participating in the question period.
Thank you.
Adrian, are you ready to go? We're just going to need to switch over the presentations, and I believe Megan's working on that right now.
Sure.
Great. So, Adrian, just so you're aware, the screen, you should be able to advance the slides by clicking on the lower left-hand side of the screen, the arrows back and forth.
Okay.
And thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your experience from the District of Saanich.
My pleasure. Yeah, I've called my presentation Creating Corridors, and I'm going to be talking mostly about natural state covenants. And if there's time, I'd like to talk about ESA mapping beyond the sensitive ecosystem inventory and the experience that we've had there. So just briefly, for anyone who hasn't been to Victoria or nearby Saanich, there's just some general facts. We're the largest municipality in the CRD, and as Deborah Curran already showed, we have a mix of urban and rural, and a lot of freshwater environments, marine coast, and our ecosystems are basically the coastal Douglas fir and a lot of Garryoak ecosystems within that. Just an overview, we don't have a natural areas protection plan or something like that, and it would be great if we did, but we just have over time just tacked things on to what we started with, and the first thing was we started acquiring the major floodplains and the lands along the Colquitts River starting in 1967. And I think we have actually completed now the purchase of all properties along the Colquitts River. There might be one or two small ones left to go. It's taken that long, but you have to start somewhere. And then we did create the urban containment boundary in 1968, and you can see the on the map there the built-up area in brown, the agricultural area bordering that boundary, and then it gets into the forested areas, Todd Creek watershed, for example. And in the 70s, they started the staff environmental group, which is kind of interesting. I would have liked to have seen that. But they did some reports, some key reports that helped people to start setting priorities, especially along marine shoreline protection. In the 90s, we also had a Healthy Saanich committee, and they created a report to council and had all of these recommendations for creating a healthier environment in Saanich. It was a really important document and started the ball rolling for all of these things really that you see stemming from that through the 90s, including their environmental and social review process for looking at impacts of development during the approval process. The first environmental planner on the island, it was 1994. Interesting, in the Healthy Saanich report, they called for hiring a staff environmentalist. And then in 95, we started using natural state covenants and tree covenants quite regularly. In 97, we had our tree bylaw. It may have been before that. It probably was, but that was we've updated it quite recently in the last couple of years, and 97 was when we had the previous bylaw change. And in 98, we had our first ESA Atlas published. And then in the 2000s, we started doing things that were a little more specific on the landscape. We had our Garryoak restoration project for 10 years with basically all these sites in our parks that we were restoring and with the community. We had our first watershed-based DPA in 2001. Council adopted the Naturescape BC principles. they endorsed the Garryoak Ecosystem Recovery Team strategy, and we had our streamside development permit area, and in 2011 we published our environmental GIS layers. And honestly, I think back before that time, and I can't even really remember not having all of that excellent information at our fingertips. But really, before 2011, we were all paper-based. And then in 2012, we adopted another development permit area to capture the marine and terrestrial environments. And then over the past 4 years, we've been doing a mapping initiative to try to fill in the gaps left behind from sensitive ecosystems inventory and other mapping products. Not that great of a map, but this starts to illustrate when you put all those bits and pieces that I just listed, and you put that towards the landscape. This is what it starts looking like. So you can see where the, I'll just do a close-up actually, where you can see along the coastline we've got our development permit areas to protect the marine area in dark blue. And the big blue blob in the middle is an older forest development permit area. And all the colored lines, those are the streamside setbacks. And in red, near the bottom there, you can see a little blotch of red bits, and those are our natural state covenants in one particular area. So you can start seeing how things start connecting together in the landscape. Or you can look at it this way. We had some artwork done recently by a local artist to help us communicate some of our bylaws and policies and the overall vision. And this was one that she made showing we use this and label all the elements, but it shows how all the different bylaws and policies to protect the environment work together to create these corridors through the landscape. So now looking into natural state covenants, there's nothing really new about these Section 219 covenants, but we did a study actually, and it's 10 years old, and we always talk about updating it, but I don't think a lot has changed since then in terms of what I'm about to present. We did a little study because we kept getting questions about, is it really worth it? These are the kind of questions we would get, once the applicant has finished developing the site, does the protection really happen? Doesn't the homeowner just move in and mow it all down? Won't all the wildlife that moved during construction never return? There's no point in doing this without regularly monitoring these sites. Why punish people who haven't paved and mowed? Why bother? It's too small. It's full of invasive plants. All these statements, and we felt, is this really true or not? It was our feeling that, there could be some issues, but was it worth it in the end? So we did a bit of a study, and the Section 219 of the Land Titles Act allows the municipality to register a covenant to protect, maintain, enhance, restore any specific amenity. And they're legal agreements, they're permanently registered against a property, and they do require the willingness of the landowner at the time to sign the document. And so one of the benefits of a natural state covenant is that it's not just the trees that are protected, but all the vegetation and natural features that you want to protect. You can write that into your covenant. Our covenant document restricts people from doing activities that impact the environment, and we have a list of them. And then you can get written permission from Saanich, which we consider on a case-by-case basis to allow you to do these things. We make our decisions based on precedence and whether it's a hardship situation or if there's any reason why these should be allowed. So since 1992, every rezoning and subdivision has been subject to our environmental review process, and so the council or the approving officer in the case of subdivision, can require or recommend natural state covenants. And then environmental services in the planning department, we're the ones who do the administration of it. As in 2004, we had about 150 properties with covenants, natural state covenants in Saanich. And so now what happens is when people come forward with a development proposal, they usually already identify the areas that they're going to offer up for covenanting. And so about 11% of our annual registered subdivision and rezoning plans results in a natural state covenant. So what gets covenanted? Number one is what is offered by the developer, which isn't always what we want. So we do end up with a few odd things covenanted that, they offer up, and maybe council says, well, that sounds like a good idea, and then we're stuck with it. Rare ecosystems or habitat of rare species, those are the things that we really focus on. Also areas that provide linkages or areas that are restored during development, and wildlife corridors. And the wildlife corridors, too, they can be something that is existing or is going to be developed with planting, etc., during development. So in 2004, and sorry, this font is pretty small, but it gives you an idea of the types of areas that we covenant. From the top, there's wildlife corridors, Garryoak ecosystems, riparian corridors, mixed forests or on steep slopes usually, wetlands, coniferous forest, rare plant species, the marine backshore, hedgerows, which is, again, something that environmental staff would not necessarily recommend, but we end up administrating. And then naturescape covenants, which sometimes are offered up by the developer, where they decide that they're going to take a naturescape approach and do all this work, and then they want it to be covenanted. The most of the covenants are fairly small, except the riparian ones. They are generally larger. Now there's not so much of a need for riparian covenants because the streamside development permit area it makes that a bit redundant. So coniferous forests and Garryoak ecosystems are really what make up the highest number of covenants in Saanich. So when you compare that to park acquisition, it averages 10 hectares a year, and natural state covenants add about 3.6 hectares a year of protected area. So it's about, it's less than half the amount that we get through park acquisition. The one difference is, of course, is that we didn't have to spend money in order to acquire protection for the environment in these areas. So the best case scenario, this is just based on our experience in which covenant areas actually make a difference on the landscape and survive as well. The best cases are when they're determined by a biologist, whether it's a consultant or a staff person, because then they usually make more sense and have more viability. Backyard covenants are better than front yard ones, which tend to get mowed. They're best if they connect to other protected areas, and once you start one, then the justification for others as they come up is set. Covenants that do not block views of the ocean, you do end up in conflict quite often. We've had to develop some guidelines for tree pruning for views. An area that's large enough to be noticed, that you can delineate with a split rail fence, are the ones that survive the best. It's best to contact owners every few years to either catch the new owner or remind the existing owner that they do have a covenant. We do a mail out with a brochure and a letter. We collect bonds for restoration for about a 2-year period. If there's a development where the ivy has taken over an area, but we want to secure the area because of its connectivity value, we can collect bonds for restoration. Establishing a baseline, it doesn't have to be super detailed, but having some photographs and a description of the types of plants there is very useful when you get to having to compare down the road. And allowing some flexibility for homeowners to use and enjoy their property without ruining it tends to see people carry on with the covenant. So measuring success, we looked at unauthorized incidents, and we had about 27% of our covenant areas where we had some unauthorized incident, and we also about 20% of them we've given permission for activities. So we had, by 2004, about 9 breaches or permits that were addressed annually. These things are more a measure of administrative time rather than viability of the covenants. So we looked at all of our natural state covenants, and we asked ourselves, has the covenant succeeded in conserving the environment given its urban setting? And we responded no to only 7% of covenants. So in other words, there are some losses and ones that have not made sense, and we figure it's less than 10% of our covenants. So overall, we consider this to be a fairly high success rate, but so is the time it takes to have to give letters of permission and investigate breaches. We estimate an average of 4 hours a week. That sometimes it's much less in terms of administration time. So we think that if it's worth protecting during the development process, it's worth putting a covenant on it, and we have found that to be quite successful. So that's what I had on natural state covenants. I do have also some slides on our mapping initiative. Just wondering if I still have another 5 or so minutes for that topic. Not sure if...
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so I'll talk about our ESA mapping initiative, which has taken place over the past 4 years. Here's just some photographs of the types of places that we're discovering through this process, including older forests. And here we define those as being where the average tree age is 100 years or more. So this project was specified in the official community plan, and then it trickled down to the annual strategic plan, where staff were asked to look at inventorying more areas that had been missed and looking at the connectivity and biodiversity elements. So as I mentioned, we first published our ESA Atlas in 1999. We've had 2 updates. There's a list of all the layers that we have in our atlas. And so we looked at mainly the sensitive ecosystems inventory, the wetlands, and yeah, I guess those were the main things, and rare ecosystems, and looking at how to increase the coverage in our mapping of those things. So we started by creating a technical advisory group with representatives from staff, various departments, Canadian Wildlife Service, the Conservation Data Center, Ministry of Forests, and Gary Oak team. And we met to talk about, criteria and standards for data collection and priorities, because we only had so much money. And so in that first year, we hired a biologist and started a project website to keep everybody informed about the project. And then in 2012, it was our first phase, and this was kind of an interesting phase because we had a public campaign for people to come forward and identify sites for the biologist to consider. And so she responded to these, completed some field work, and we did a public presentation on the sites. And then the following year, we gave the same biologists full rein to go ahead and determine sites using air photo interpretation. And then we contacted landowners to allow her to access these lands so she could do her inventory work. And again, she completed this and did a public presentation. Phase 3, which we really weren't anticipating, and I'll go into these phases a little bit more in terms of our findings, but when the landowners who agreed in 2013 for us to come onto their property found out that others said no, they thought, well, those others who said no should be included as well. Otherwise, it's almost penalizing people who are cooperative. And so we did phase 3 by using air photo interpretation. And then phase 4 was looking at the coastal Douglas fir TEM mapping that was available and trying to find a way to interpret that and potentially add sites to our atlases. And that's about where we are now. And so we have a lot of new data, and we still have to decide what we're going to do with it and introduce it to the public as well. So some of the criteria that we used for site evaluation had to do with ecological integrity, looking at the surrounding landscape, the condition of the site, and the restoration potential, and then what our consultant was calling the function and biodiversity values, which was looking at the linking of areas, buffering, habitat, and species present. And then she also looked at size and ownership as they pertain to the feasibility of a site in surviving if it was to be protected. And then she categorized them from poor to excellent in terms of their conservation values. She used a corridor approach when looking at where to focus in the municipality, given its size. And so she looked at connecting areas between major parks and water bodies. And those bright green arrows that you see are the areas that she focused her air photo interpretation in order to determine sites to look at. So in phase 1, and this was the one that the public, members of the public came forward and made recommendations, we found 29 new ESAs. You can see they range in everything from sensitive ecosystems to a bald eagle nest. We had quite an extensive inventory by the Victoria Natural History Society of right-of-ways, and so our consultant used that to look at undeveloped right-of-ways that had potential and that maybe council would want to close some of these right-of-ways rather than retain them for future roads and such. Phase 2, I think one of the most interesting things about this is the results of the landowner contact. So this is our biologist. She decided on a bunch of sites using air photo interpretation that she wanted to visit. We sent out letters to the landowners introducing the project and asking for permission to enter the property. And 43% actually gave permission, and 44% did not respond at all, leaving only 14 to say no. And I thought that was actually pretty good, considering that we let them know that in time some of these mapped areas may become formally protected. So in the end, we found 30 new sensitive ecosystems and 2 isolated wetlands. These are just divided up into our inventory types, and as well as some individual trees that were old or wildlife trees. So as I mentioned, phase 3 was unanticipated. We were told by the public that this is what they wanted after our other phase, and we had originally identified that we wanted to find another 100 previously unmapped sites. with no minimum size, of course, because if you're going to have 100 sites, then they may not be that big, because otherwise they would have been captured by another inventory. And that was to really match what the contract value was, what our funds were really to do this project. And for this project, we also had some federal funding. And so we did end up with 98 new sites, and 60% of them scoring very high, and on our own properties. So it's not all about private land. It's a lot about public as well, because we need to know where these areas are. And there's those undeveloped right-of-ways coming up again from that from the recommendations of the Victoria Natural History Society. And then phase 4 was looking at the conservation, or the coastal Douglas fir product, and there are 903 polygons in Saanich. So that's a huge number, and it was whittled down looking at the ecosystem codes and structural stage in the dominant and subdominant components of all the polygons, and that information is embedded in the mapping product. And our consultant had a look at 346 polygons and found 221 were of high priority. And then another 76 really should be looked at more closely. So the kinds of results that we're seeing, here's one where we had the sensitive ecosystem inventory in gold, and we added to it in red. Those are areas that were missed. And then in blue is the undeveloped right-of-way inventory, which connects into the same area. And here's another one where it's a combination of older forest, the big polygon, and the small one is herbaceous terrestrial, which would have been too small on its own using the original SEI methodology. But in this way, she's combined the two ecosystems, and because we don't have a minimum size criteria, she mapped them together in this way, which on a landscape level makes a lot of sense. So in the end, I know this map is rather small, but it starts to show how these additional areas link into the existing areas, which are in solid colors. And at the moment, we haven't published any of this in our atlases. It's a long process to take all of this data and make it fit with our current products, and also to create the educational materials to go with it and inform the public so that people are on board because they understand. And so that's the phase that we're at now, is going through all the data and trying to figure out how to best present it. And that's the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Adrian, for that presentation. I think what we'll do is we'll take one question and then go to Todd, just to stay on time. So Pamela has asked, how do you deal with confidentiality issues around species at risk, presence occurrences, in respect to sharing info with the public? And then she says specifically she's thinking about highly sensitive sites or species occurrences that fall in private lands.
Well, at this time, we're only using rare species occurrences from the Conservation Data Center that are publicly available on their own mapping system. So I don't think we've had to deal with confidentiality because we've kept it to that level. And all of those sites, all the known rare species sites, have been put in our environmental development permit area. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think that probably helps for sure. And Pamela can ask if she wants any further clarification. Okay, well, we'll take there's two more questions coming in. I will entertain these since that was a quick answer. So that one is from Jerry, who's asking a similar question to what he asked Heather. What follow-up has occurred in penalties tickets to ensure that the remediation has been effective and over what time period? I'm not sure if this applies yet for your presentation, potentially to the natural covenants.
Yeah, I would think it would be the natural state covenants. The fines are written into the covenant documents, and we have occasionally fined people. Normally what we do is require restoration if there's been some damage, but if the damage cannot be fixed, for example, it's been blasted or mature trees have been removed, yeah, concrete, that's another one. We've had a few cases. It doesn't happen that often, but we do fine people. We usually calculate what the fine is, and then we negotiate on what they would actually pay because it would be too much otherwise. But yeah, we have done that, but we find the restoration to be a much better objective if we can do that. We get a lot more landowner buy-in that way as well.
Some great questions coming in here. And Jennifer is asking, what are incentives for private landowners to enter into nature state covenants?
Well, most covenants are entered into as a development proposal, so I guess the incentive is that you get to develop your land. But we do have people who voluntarily enter into covenants as well. We don't have any financial incentives. We do occasionally do things like free invasive species pickup, and we also will come to people's properties and give them advice and tips for managing invasive species. So, and I think an incentive as well is just the fact that we do have written into the covenant that we can give permission for certain things. It helps people to accept that there's still some wiggle room in there in the future if they need it.
Great. Thank you so much again, Adrian, for sharing your experience and answering some of these questions. Sure. Really appreciate your time today on this. Todd, are you here?
I believe I am.
All right. So I don't know, Megan, if you need to switch presentations again or if it's just going to roll into Todd's. But Todd, you had mentioned to me earlier that you can go on for a long time if you want, or that if you're allowed. So I can give you like a 5-minute warning if you want to take in some questions at the end. Does that work for you? And I think I just wanted to mention that we do have this space, I believe, available till 4 p.m. So I know it said 3:30 for some of you, and if some of you have to leave early, we'll understand. For those who want to linger and listen to some of the questions at the end, you're welcome to do that as well. Todd, I'm going to, I'll give you a warning at, say, 2:30. Does that work?
Sounds great.
Okay, take it away.
Thanks, Neil, and thanks for that introduction about me going on and on. That's going to give those guys over in West Kelowna something to give me a hard time about here next time I see them. Yeah, so thanks so much, Neil, and everybody for joining this webinar today. It's a great honor to be asked to talk about something that's been on, well, the project has been on the corner of my desk for quite some time, but it's one of my first loves here at the job, and it's the Mission Creek Restoration Initiative, something that I've been involved with for 15 years or so. So I guess I'll jump right into the first joke of my presentation, which is the Policy for Management of Fish Habitat, which was a document that the federal government published when I graduated high school. So again, some more information there for those guys from West Kelowna to give me a hard time about next time we're talking about fish habitat issues. But it's a document that I start off with because before getting into the banking strategy here at the City of Kelowna, it's a policy document that we found obviously to be very helpful, very helpful guiding document. The basics of it was it's to look for a net gain and for habitat for specifically fisheries. And it was, for us, it was the principal source of requirements for mitigation compensation for HADs, which again, so I'm kind of dating myself. So we're talking about old documents and HADs and federal fisheries that are no longer present here in the valley. But we did at one point in time have a really great working relationship with them and provincial staff. So the guiding document, the goals of it obviously were three-part: fish habitat conservation, fish habitat restoration, and fish habitat development. We think that the Mission Creek project fit all three of these. So the guiding principle, obviously, of the document was a no net loss of productive capacity of habitats, and we think it's fundamental to habitat conservation goal here with the City of Kelowna and all the work that we do. So to jump right into habitat compensation banking, for those of you that don't know much about habitat compensation banks, it's kind of lumped into two camps, one being the physical habitat compensation bank and the other being a financial habitat compensation bank. The physical habitat compensation bank is basically an area created in advance, or it's an area that's been preserved. And it's basically for the purpose of compensating for those anticipated losses in advance of unavoidable losses. So typically, once you create one of these wetlands, you're assigned a number of credits based on the extent of the restoration, and of course there's a dollar value associated with that. And then of course these habitat credits are purchased. And for those of you that know about mitigation banks, it's a fairly booming business in the United States. Financial Habitat Compensation Bank, it's one of those ones that can be approved ahead of time, and it's one where you can take those compensation dollars and dedicate them to a fund for a specific project. For us, it was a bit of a upwards hill, I guess, or uphill climb to begin with, because we were always looking for ways to create a habitat compensation banking system here in the City of Kelowna as a means of sort of dealing with those environmental impacts that we regularly dealt with when it came to infrastructure development, specifically around creek corridors and riparian areas. So our interest here at the city, came basically from the desire to find a more consistent approach to determining measures, identifying appropriate compensation measures when impacts to fish and fish habitat were unavoidable. And then finally, for us, it was really about directing compensation or directing our resources into areas that we thought were the most effective in restoring habitat. So again, the bank itself, these types of banks, in our case with Mission Creek, can be used to provide a consolidated compensation across Mission Creek and to direct those into one location or one larger area. So some of the downfalls with this type of program is that the estimates that you give early on can be inaccurate by the time the actual project is completed, and then there's no guarantee of actually when the work or when the habitat replacement is going to happen. So that's one of the struggles we dealt with our friends at Fisheries and Oceans Canada and with the province, was really nailing this down, and it was one of our biggest hurdles early on. So why we wanted to do this, sort of jumped into that a little earlier, but again, we wanted to identify a way of dealing with infrastructure development that we knew were going to impact some of our creek systems, and trying to identify ahead of time, and I guess, pardon the expression, but trying to put as many eggs in one basket that we could, that we knew we were going to have as much, a really effective area for restoring habitat. Just the image on the left-hand side is the document, the most recent document that we completed in June 2007 that sort of laid out the phase 2 of the strategy. And you can just Google Mission Creek Habitat Compensation Bank and find that quite readily on the internet. Just a couple images here to give you an understanding of some of the projects we worked on. This was the Casorso Bridge project before the bridge was expanded. This was a single traffic bridge in both directions, and of course we wanted to upgrade that bridge, and that's basically what it looks like after. So of course you've got quite a bit of riparian habitat loss, you've got some wetland habitat loss, and of course you've got some spawning areas that were disturbed or potentially even destroyed, and putting in the piers to this bridge structure. So again, we knew that there was areas that we were going to impact the creek, spawning habitat, riparian areas, wetlands, and we wanted to, instead of the typical way of dealing with it was we would have maybe planted, an area in close proximity here, and we wanted to, with the goal of, with Mission Creek, as I'll get into, moving the dikes back and really restoring a meander. We really needed to focus on a bigger area and have a higher level of thinking. So this is the Gordon Drive Bridge pre-construction. Again, you see some wetlands in the area and somewhat limited riparian area in this area, but of course, when you beef up the dikes on both sides and increase the width of the bridge, you're looking at a substantial amount of new infrastructure there, and there were some substantial impacts to fish and fish habitat on this crossing as well. So I didn't want to complicate two things too much, but again, you can find this within the habitat mitigation document. Just give you a sense of what the formula looked like. There's a lot of background on this, so it's not something I can easily explain very quickly. But basically, it's the amount of square meters that you have, the relative habitat value of that type of habitat, the compensation ratio, and the compensation bank costs, dollars per square meters, and sort of gives you below there a sense of dollar values. I think that was the dollar value associated with the Casorso Bridge, Casorso Road, Casorso roundabout upgrade. So that money was put aside for property acquisition. So again, the City of Kelowna's guiding principles on this, obviously, in agreement with the Fisheries and Oceans Canada and the province, that obviously we're going to try and adhere to, as best we could, to the no loss principle, use the like-for-like habitat principle, and of course, on any projects that we worked on, use the habitat impact hierarchy of avoid, mitigate, and compensate, something that we still do use today. So to jump into from banking to the Mission Creek Restoration Initiative, sort of give you a sense of how this, I guess, translates onto the ground. The initiative itself is a multi-stakeholder partnership that we formalized actually in 2008. The Mission Creek Restoration Project itself started in '98, really got off the ground in 2001, 2002. Back in those days, we were really very focused on fish and fish habitat only. Just to give you a sense of where Mission Creek is, City of Kelowna, and you can sort of see the corridor running from the east side of the photo through the Mission Creek Canyon, coming out onto the floodplain or the fan, and then and back in the good old days, we'd push it right up against the side of the hill as best we could on the south side, and dike it on the north side. And of course, as it gets closer to the lake, it's being diked on both sides. So Mission Creek itself, a little bit of background. It's one of the largest subbasins in the Okanagan Valley. It's estimated that it puts about 25% of all water that flows into Okanagan Lake every spring, comes out of that drainage. It comes from the Greystokes area, just a little bit east of the Big White area for those skiers out there, and it's fairly high altitude and gets quite a bit of snowpack up there. So fish and wildlife stocks in the valley or in that part of the sub-basin are fairly substantial. Mission Creek was designated a BC Heritage River in '97. Tons of recreational opportunities from the back end of the system, snowmobiling right down to the lake, where of course there's provides fairly significant rainbow trout recreational fishery on the lake, and canoeing, paddling, that type of thing. So it goes without saying it's considered one of the valley's most important waterways. The photo, obviously from just the last image there, but just wanted to give you a sense of what things used to do before we really nailed it down and engineered the heck out of it and diked it. Finally started diking it in the 30s and 40s and finally got it right in the 50s. And this is a photo from pre-diking, and this is something that happened on a fairly regular occurrence on the Kelowna floodplain. This is an ortho image or an air photo image that we put together from 1938. You can really see what Mission Creek looked like in the late 1930s, and a number of the old side channels and oxbows throughout. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit on that. It really gives you a sense of the amount of riparian vegetation and amount of river, amount of fish and wildlife habitat that existed in the Mission area of Kelowna. You can see there on the right-hand side, I know you can't read that, but there's an active floodplain or an active channel in there, and it's about 80 meters wide in that area, and it's kind of going back and forth, and obviously doesn't have any constraints on it at that point in time. But I love this image because my imagination kind of runs away with this image. I think of the name of Kelowna, which is Kelowna, which is the Okanagan Nation word for sow grizzly. And I can just think back before pre-settlement, where this area would have just been lush cottonwood stands with just unbelievable understory of red osier dogwood and rosa thickets for hundreds and hundreds of meters. And of course, the kokanee would have been spawning in there by the millions. And of course, those mama grizzly bears would have been down in there with all their cubs, really enjoying that habitat. So to kind of give you a comparison of that photo to today, the one on the top, obviously the 1938 image, and the one on the bottom, the 2009. Really worth noting is, I think I mentioned it was about 80 meters wide, that one section just directly downstream of that. You're looking at a channel that on average was 60 to 80 meters in width, and approximately from the mouth up to the canyon was about 30 kilometers in length. Now we're looking at about 30 meters wide and 11 kilometers in length. And what's also worth noticing there is on the north side of the river is there's a couple of old oxbows that are still existing today that we're trying to get our hands on. So the real issues, as I think I've kind of just illustrated with that image, is that there's a significant amount of the river that was diked for agricultural or flooding purposes back in the 50s. We lost a significant amount of the creek's length, and with that, of course, a lot of spawning and rearing habitats and wetland riparian areas. But we've also lost a heck of a lot of ecological and recreational opportunities as well. So again, an image of a flood that occurred. I believe this one is from the late 1940s. And you can see they're doing everything in their power to try and get the bridge back in place and protect the riverbank. So our vision as the Mission Creek Restoration Initiative is pretty simple. We're here to restore and protect Mission Creek as best we can, and to really enrich the historical, ecological, recreational values for the entire Okanagan Valley. The mission: restore the creek, improve flood protection, conserve and expand species at risk, and protect biodiversity as best we can, and to really inspire our community to get behind this. And in order to do that, we've nurtured and created as many partnerships as we can not only to secure fundings for the project, but also to sort of get everybody in our community behind it. Quick image of section along Springfield Road. Mission Creek is diked on both sides. You can really get a sense of how straight the river is, how the lack of diversity, the lack of complexity in the channel, and therefore the channel just basically functions as one long riffle or run with very limited pool habitat. This is really what we're trying to achieve with our project. This is a section of river just downstream of that last image where we've only got the dike on one side of the river, so the channel is allowed to meander back and forth. A lot of the project benefits we see, I think we've kind of probably preaching to the converted mostly here, but really what we've noticed in the last few years is our fisheries, sport fishery really continues to take a bit of a nosedive. Flooding seems to be occurring more and more often. And of course, we're really starting to see a lot of sediment accumulation in the channel. So one of the things that's really come to a head for us in the last little while is flood protection. And the biggest one, obviously, is just the fact that the dikes that were constructed back in the 1950s, well, they were constructed in the 50s, and they've kind of been patched here and there since then. But they really don't meet today's standards. The second biggest issue that we've seen or had happen is the flood events that we've seen on a fairly regular basis. I've thrown out a couple numbers there: 90 cubic meters a second and 130. Prior to 2007, we had a fairly significant flood event on June 16th, 2007, and it was running at about 90 cubic meters per second, which is pretty decent for Mission Creek. And prior to 2007, the last big event was in the 50s. And so I remember walking the river channel that day with Don Dobson. He's a well-known hydrologist in our valley here. And he was, giving me the old, "Oh, shucks, kid, good for you. Some guys go their whole career without seeing these types of things." Well, I did. I got to see a significant flood event in 2007. Unfortunately, I've gotten to see a heck of a lot more since then. There were significant events in 2011. 2012 was really, and 2013 were really the big ones, though, where we had 3 separate events, 3 distinct, not 3 days in a row, 3 distinct events of greater or equal to 90 cubic meters per second in 1 year. We thought that was fairly significant. And then, of course, and we weren't prepared, but 2013 was a near miss. We figured the dikes can hold about 130 cubic meters per second. And in 2013, we had 130 cubic meters per second ripping down through our community. So the flood impact and the need to better our dikes and improve flood protection is quite significant where we reside here. So why restore fish and wildlife habitat again? I think most of you know why. But for us, Mission Creek, the keystone kind of species for us are the kokanee that spawn both in Mission Creek and on the shores of Okanagan Lake. And of course, the big rainbow trout in Okanagan Lake, the big guys that you might, if you know some sport fishermen that catch some of these big giant lake fish in the interior here. Those are the guys that live in the lake, the fluvial rainbows that come up Mission Creek every spring and spawn. So why is it important? Well, we used to have a significant amount of kokanee come up, like I said before, millions and millions of kokanee used to come up Mission Creek. We've now, and we used to produce greater than 80% of all the stream spawning kokanee used to spawn in Mission Creek for the entire Okanagan, and about what they thought was about 50% of the rainbow trout population. And fortunately now we're well down in terms of capacity for that sport fishery. So again, creek channelization has had a significant impact on a lot of the species at risk and the biodiversity in that area. We're very fortunate, though, that we've got a number of cottonwood stands along the river that are still intact. They just need to be protected, and that's what we're trying to do. and promoting stewardship, we really believe that this is a really key aspect to the success of our project. Not only does it, we're always building awareness and getting in the media and doing interviews and doing presentations as often as we can, but of course, we're really about making a cultural or social shift, I think, as Deborah was alluding to earlier, that, really needing to change behavior. I can remember a time when, a number of years ago, when, development permits, it was always a fight, always fighting with whether it's developers or homeowners on, achieving a protection at the back of a lot or steep hillside or whatever. I honestly can say we don't really do that a heck of a lot anymore. We've the society sort of has shifted here, and the politics has shifted. Somebody mentioned earlier in the notes there in the chat section about the ALC or the ALR areas. Yeah, we still have our challenges there in Kelowna here, that's for sure. 50% of our land base is in the ALR. So that's our new battle these days. But on the environment front, it seems that things are a little easier than they were maybe 15 years ago. So just a quick graph here showing you the different stages of where we've come from. 2005 to 2013 was a lot of really planning and coordination for that section of river. And now we're into stage 2, which I'm proud to say I just got out of a construction meeting this morning, and we're moving forward with dike setback construction here this month. Pretty exciting stuff. So the stage 1 accomplishments, just a heck of a lot of work. We developed the terms of reference, memorandum of understanding with all our partners, and of course a guide to how we were going to make all this work. Like I said earlier, created the Mission Creek Habitat Compensation Bank. We hired a project coordinator. I'm sort of proud to say we're on to our 3rd project coordinator right now. First project coordinator was very technically skilled biologist. The second one was a communications expert, and now we're moving into the construction phase. So we've hired somebody that's obviously very skilled at managing construction projects. We've raised well over $2 million in funding for this project. We've completed a heck of a lot of technical assessments, air photo interpretation, that type of thing, channel assessments, channel width assessments, sediment source surveys, that type of thing. We've acquired a number of properties, and we've developed quite a number of communication and outreach tools. So this is the stretch of river that we have been concentrating on. If you know Kelowna at all, it's on the way out to the Mission. The eastern bridge is the Casorso Road Bridge, and the western bridge is the Gordon Drive Bridge. The channel that we're working on is the south side of, or the dike, I should say, is the south dike of the river. So the methodology is fairly simple. It's not simple to make happen, but it's fairly simple in terms of what the methodology is. It's basically to move the dikes back to give the river a little bit more room and to reestablish that floodplain. Go back one image, you can see how there's some old oxbows on the north side of the river there that we'd like to reconnect, restore the creek banks as best we can, plant some of those agricultural fields, get them back to a riparian vegetation condition, create as many wetlands and lowlands and areas for species at risk. A lot of salamanders and toads and things like that we have here in the Okanagan. Of course, and maintain the Mission Creek Greenway, which is one of the jewels in Kelowna. It's a significant recreational corridor that's used on a daily basis by hundreds of people in Kelowna. And as well, we've been working with our partners with the Ministry of Agriculture and the Agricultural Land Commission on this project to, using up a bit of ag land here, obviously for creek setback, but we're doing our best to improve the agricultural land adjacent to the dike. It's an image I like to throw in here from 1998, the Mission Creek restoration project that was a report that was done back then, and it just sort of gives you a little bit of an idea of a sketch drawing that we put together back then that It's basically the early concept right from 1998 onward. This is another image of that section of river from the air. You can see the on the south side of the river, or the right side of your photo, you see the Mission Creek Rec Park, and then you've got West Bank First Nation Reserve further up just by the bridge there, and some agricultural properties in between. Just to give you a real conceptual look, this is the area again. The blue line represents the existing channel. The white line conceptually kind of gives you an idea of what it could look like, or what it may have looked like a number of years ago. So now we're into stage 2. Again, we don't stop raising money. Seems like we're sending. We've got a long list of grant applications that are continually being applied for, and properties that are continually being negotiated for. We did the biophysical baseline assessment. We've done some detailed engineering plans for this stretch. Been introducing it to the public as best we can, putting some performance monitoring parameters in place, and of course moving forward with permits so that we can begin construction at the end of the month. Going to throw an image in here just to sort of take you back a couple of years when we started looking at some of the properties of interest. And again, we would we went out to the public at one point and meeting with different neighborhood groups and with different property owners and farmers to get a sense of gauging their interest, and you can get a sense very rapidly of which sections of river you'll run into hurdles with in terms of project partnering with landowners, that type of thing. This stretch was chosen because we had a couple different homeowners or property owners to deal with. The old oxbows were there. Engineers loved it because you've got 2 fixed points, being the 2 bridges, and of course the city of Kelowna owning a significant amount of land in that area as well. So we jumped right into it, right off the bat with the Casorso property. Was the Casorso family at 3850 Swamp Road. That was our first purchase, just over 7. I think it was about 7 acres in size, I believe. The final tally on the size of that lot once we kind of tweaked some lines here and there. This is another property that we've recently purchased, just over 4 acres. And this is a photo from just last week out in the field with the surveyors identifying where the future dike location is going to be, which actually is represented by the blue line on this image here. So that's the project in a nutshell. I'd like to couldn't have done all this hard work without the partnerships. There's been a lot of collaboration going on. Too numerous to name, but these are definitely the heavy hitters that have helped us out. We've got the Central Okanagan Land Trust, Friends of Mission Creek, West Bank First Nation, Okanagan Nation Alliance. Again, our friends at DFO, many ministries. These are the 2 that we dealt with on a regular basis, but many over the years. Our friends at the Regional District who manage and maintain the Greenway, and then of course the University of British Columbia, and the funding partners, the Habitat Conservation Trust Fund, Okanagan Region Wildlife Heritage Fund Society, Trout Unlimited Canada, and Okanagan Basin Water Board, and then our friends again at the province and the federal level. That's it. Any questions out there?
Great, thank you, Todd, and thanks for wrapping up right around the time we needed to. So I just was speaking to Megan offline, and we will stay online for another 15 minutes till 3:45. The presenters are welcome to stay online as well. So, and if there's any questions anybody has at this point, we can bring them up to Todd. Todd, I guess one I have for you is based on those cost estimates you started with on one of the slides, do you find that they were appropriate targets for the amount of habitat for doing the offsets?
Well, I think the original number we came up with in about 2005 was $24 million. And that was for a fairly significant amount of land acquisition. That didn't even cover the cost of moving the dikes themselves. And so that was a bit of a turning point for us. We started to focus a heck of a lot more on putting wood and rock in the channel to try and create as much fish habitat as we could. But 2007 was a real wake-up call, and of course, 2012 and 13 have been even more so. But 2007, we realized that if we had spent all that money putting rock and wood in the channel, it would have ended up out in the lake because it was one hell of a flow that year. So it was that point in time that we realized, well, the $24 million is something that really needs to be looked into a bit more. And the more we did look into it across the world, globally, they're restoring rivers all over the place, and really $24 million is a drop in the bucket compared to what they're spending, especially in different parts of Europe right now.
So we do have a question that came in. Great presentation, Todd. When did the project Habitat Compensation Bank originally initiate?
Well, the concept was alive and well for quite some time. When we actually signed the documents and everything with the feds, I believe it was 2007. Was the summer of 2007 is when it actually was formalized.
And has there been, and here's another question that came in, has there been any impact to this project from the changes with the Fisheries Act?
No, I mean, the only impact has really been, I wouldn't say anything related to the Fisheries Act at all, to be honest with you, but the federal fisheries folks left our valley a number of years ago, so we don't have a presence here so much anymore. Changes to the Fisheries Act, any of the changes that we've been proposing thus far on the ground type of stuff, you submit to them, and they're not interested whatsoever. So they defer to the province on most of the stuff that we're doing.
Somebody typing here, but I'm not sure if I'll get a question or not. Maybe one thing I'll pose to all the presenters, and I'm going to wear just not the Wetland Stewardship Partnership hat for this question, but another our BC Wildlife Federation question, being a nonprofit and sort of being able to advocate for government policy and changes. From a provincial level or from a federal level, do the municipalities and regional governments that we spoke to today, do you feel that you have enough political support from those two higher levels of government to basically demonstrate effective environmental policy at the level? And I guess where this question comes from is in some conversations that we've had, we've noticed that the local governments are able to use provincial and federal legislation as sort of a backstop against pressures they may have either politically or socially from, say, developers or private landowners about why are they receiving these types of policies. And Todd, I guess since if you want to answer first, that'd be great.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, the city of Kelowna, I mean, we're fairly conservative riding here, I guess, both provincially and federally. So it sort of gives you a sense, I think, of where people's views are politically. So people's land is very important to them, and being told what they can and can't do on their land is also quite important to them. We did find, right out of the gate when we were dealing with the streamside protection regulation before RAR, that it was quite a bit of an uphill battle. But once we did get the politicians on board with riparian area setbacks in our OCP and onward, I mean, it's been 20 years now here in Kelowna, that it just became, honestly, within, I would say, probably by about 2007, it really has become a non-issue in our community. People understand why riparian setbacks are there and the need for them. So I don't know if that answers your question at all, Neil, but that's my attempt to answer it.
Sure, and I guess just because it's, I'm just going to jump in here. I've heard a few beeps off, so those that are still with us and are willing to stay till 3:45, I just wanted to say thank you for anybody that does need to leave. We will be sending out a link to the new Green Bylaws Toolkit as soon as it's released, as well as you can send copies your way as well. And a recording of this presentation will also be made available for those who would like. I will switch gears because Pamela has added in I don't know if it's a comment or a question, so I'll just read it out. Thanks, Adrian. We don't have quite the same human infrastructure-wise to do the work we generate at the SCCP, so it is always a conundrum how to utilize the information we generate for private lands. Although now any federal listed funded work that results in the current data. Okay, so she's basically, that's just a comment. Jerry here has, here's a question. You mentioned restoration with early records of millions of kokanee spawning. What do your plans have to achieve similar density numbers as far as monitoring future spawning runs with the new habitat areas to be created? I guess the question being, do you have population targets at this point?
Well, I mean, basically, sorry, Jerry, they, for Okanagan Lake, I mean, you know, obviously the kokanee here, you know, spend their time once they're done in the river, spend the in Okanagan Lake. And there is a thing called the Okanagan Lake Action Plan that has been ongoing now for, well, I guess it's plus 15 years, that's been trying to understand why kokanee numbers in the lake and in the rivers have decreased in numbers, and identified problems with mysis shrimp introduction and foreshore development. And of course, Okanagan Lake is a reservoir, so the fluctuation of Okanagan Lake to meet downstream irrigation needs, and it goes on and on and on. But they have sort of been one after another, sort of dealing with them, identifying what the issues are, and then doing obviously their best to try and rectify things. I don't ever think, I'm not going to sit here and tell you I think there will ever be millions of kokanee spawning in Mission Creek again. I think that we've significantly altered fish habitat both in the lake and up the river, but I do believe that there's an opportunity to restore it back to sustainable numbers. So, I mean, the nitrogen phosphorus levels in the lake, for example, years and years they had 3 significant communities on the lake taking water out of the lake system, using it for water, and of course when they clean it, they were putting it back into the lake cleaner than when they actually took it out. So actually filtering out a significant amount of the nutrients that were there historically. With the mysis shrimp, there's competition with the young kokanee. They're trying their best to remove the mysis shrimp as best they can from the system. And then the biggest thing that they've really had changes with is the fluctuation of Okanagan Lake. They've really now, it's all very automated, and they've controlled it to the shore spawners. So when the shore spawners spawn on the foreshore, they know not to drop the lake beyond a certain amount, to otherwise it would dry the eggs and that sort of thing. So like I said, there's Mission Creek, and the Mission Creek Restoration Program is only one small piece of the bigger Okanagan Lake Action Plan. And so, yeah, we'll be doing our best, obviously, to monitor the stretches that we plan to restore, and it's a no-brainer. I mean, you take a piece of highway and you put a bit of a curve in it, and you actually put some habitat into it. You build a couple pools with some nice riffles and some actual spawning habitat. You can't help but be successful with that. So.
Great. Thank you, Todd.
Neil, I can just jump in. This is Deborah. On your question about sort of the extent to which local governments are using their green bylaw powers or in relationship to federal and provincial governments. And I just You know what? I will have a big celebration the day that I can no longer say this. There isn't a single municipality or regional district in the province that uses their existing authority for creating green bylaws and for protecting the environment to its full extent. And so, you know, I would be so delighted when I can actually point to one and then be no longer relevant in this conversation. So there's always so much more that we can do given the political realities of local government compared to what they're actually authorized to do legally. So I would argue that the province and the feds are perhaps slightly more hamstrung environmentally than municipalities and regional districts are. But at the same time, at our, you know, the level that's closest to the landscape, or the level of government that's closest to the landscape in our more urbanized areas, they're not able to make full use of their powers.
Thank you, Deborah. Yeah, I guess I'm curious to know if provincial and federal government regulations are sufficient to require municipalities to do work. I think what I'm hearing from you is that it might be a political will issue at a local municipal level, but I think of things like the Fisheries Act, which compels municipality to perhaps develop stronger regulations around a particular component. And I guess my question was, if there was a feel that policy or regulations at a provincial or federal level that were stronger may be what's required to have municipalities behave differently.
Yeah, and I guess I believe that the watershed is the most appropriate level at which to do environmental protection and water planning and all those good things. But there are definitely provincial and federal performance-based standards that could be mandated that would cause us to do things exceedingly different. So an example would be to mandate in regional growth strategies and in OCPs minimum densities before you're able to move to a greenfield site. So I think there are probably a dozen of those kind of performance-based standards that, if required of local governments, would significantly change the way in which we do land development and environmental protection.
It would be great to get your thoughts on that at some point, Deborah. Thank you. I'm just going to say thank you to all of our presenters today for sharing your time and your knowledge with this group, and thank you so many of you who've stayed on to this point in time to listen into the conversation. We really appreciate you coming out today and sharing your knowledge with us, and again, we'll be sending out a copy of this to all of you. If there is a desire, if you want to just in the next few minutes write anything down that you think you'd like to learn more about, if we were to do a session like this again, we'll record any comments you have as far as other aspects of municipal and regional policies that could help protect wetlands, and maybe consider running another one of these in the near future for doing an additional sort of piece on the Green Bylaws Toolkit. If you think there's anything that might be useful, that would be very helpful for us to know. So with that, I think I just want to say thank you to all our presenters again. Thank you guys, did a great job, and really appreciate your support. Thank you, Megan, with Polis, for helping to keep us on track and to help organize this from behind the scenes. It's been incredible, the amount of support we've received from you today.
Thanks, Megan.
So yeah, and thank you, Heather, Adrian, Todd.